Yes.
I can.
Let me welcome Professor K. Babu Joseph and all of you who join with us for this K. Babu Joseph Students Meet program. This is second lecture in the lecture series in theoretical science. Now to start with, let me invite Professor Babu Joseph to introduce the series and its objectives. Welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. I'm happy to meet you all this afternoon. Today, we are having the second installment of the series, webinar series on theoretical science. Even though this was started by some of my old students, anybody who is interested in attending the lectures is welcome. Today we have Dr. Satish, an old student of mine, presenting a topic titled Something Called Nothing. He is going to talk about vacuum. And this will be followed by another presentation by Dr. Pleasant Thomas of CMS College on application of AI to biomolecules. I hope both presentations will be useful to the listeners. I don't know how many are turning. Anyway, this is going to be an important event in the series. This will be followed by more lectures at the rate of one per month. That is the present plan. So, over to Dr. Satish.
Thank you, Bob, sir. I thank all who have joined here, and I am going to start my presentation. And the name of the presentation, the title of the presentation, as you can see, is Something Called Nothing. This is actually the title of a book by Podolin, which was published in 1980s. At that time, the importance of vacuum was emerging due to the applications of quantum field theory, the development of the standard model, etc. But now that is so much applications of that. Therefore, I can comfortably change that something to everything. Everything is emerging from nothing. And today I'll be presenting in a semi-technical manner. Semi-technical manner means I'll be using equations. I'm not avoiding equations altogether, but not with very complicated equations, or I'll be mainly discussing the physics of the equations. And the topics which I plan to address is given in the title screen, that is starting from the vacuum in classical physics. I actually want to discuss the vacuum properties of the universe itself and the thermodynamics of space-time. And if possible, I shall say something about my present interest, that is the emergent gravity paradigm. So we'll start with, as usual, a historical manner, that is starting from the history of classical vacuum. Actually, a classical vacuum is not that much interesting because apart from some philosophical discussions, no experiments were seriously conducted regarding vacuum. And people thought that vacuum is nothingness. That is, if you take a jar and remove everything from that, all atoms, all dust, all radiations, everything, then what remains is called a vacuum. And the idea of vacuum started much earlier than Aristotle, but I have taken it as starting from Aristotle there. And his famous statement, that is, nature abhors vacuum. Nature always acts against vacuum. That was his idea. And he thought that the entire universe is filled with something, some static type entity. In India, actually, it was a dynamic feeling. It is not just like the Greek philosophers actually thought the entire universe is filled with a static thing, but India, it was a dynamic thing. They thought that something is filled with the dynamic entities. And that idea continued. And the eminent philosopher René Descartes in 17th century actually supported Aristotle, saying that the entire universe is filled with a particular element, which he called as the fifth element, and he named it as ether, in addition to the four elements like fire, earth, water, etc. But people did not do any experiment relating to the construction of vacuum at that time. And Aristotle actually was against doing experiments because he thought that his philosophy, we all know, is based on the fact that the ideas man generate or man discovers or man constructs is different from nature, and nature's laws are different from the laws of man. That is, nature's laws are divine and human laws are different. Therefore, he actually thought of the nature abhors vacuum as a divine law. Using the Galileo's ideas or Galileo's support, Torricelli was the person who did first time an experiment to realize vacuum in practice. He took, we all have studied it in schools, that is, he took mercury in a long glass vessel, glass tube, and then inverted it into a trough of mercury and found that above 76 centimeters there is a vacuum, which we now call as the Torricelli vacuum. And that established the idea of atmospheric pressure, etc. He discovered barometer, all those things we know from high school science. And Pascal came after that. Blaise Pascal actually did use this barometer to measure the atmospheric pressure or weight of atmosphere at different heights, and found that the atmospheric pressure decreases as we go higher and higher. And he extended that idea, and he established the fact that our atmosphere becomes thinner and thinner as we go up higher and higher, and eventually it will vanish. And therefore, above the Earth's atmosphere, there is a huge vacuum. He concluded correctly from that simple experiment. And people began to do work in constructing vacuum gauges, measurement of vacuum, etc. And that led to several technological advancements, like the incandescent bulb, the television screen, vacuum tubes, like that. But at that time, the people who supported the wave theory of light, which was immensely successful, like Robert Hooke, Christian Huygens, etc., they thought that light should be propagating inside a medium. Even Maxwell thought that light should be propagating inside a medium, through a medium, because he didn't know that a free space can have magnetization and electrification. Therefore, he also supported the fact that there is an all-pervading medium, which they call as the luminiferous ether, in the sense that something which carries lumen or light. And people, by the end of the 19th century, people almost believed in this. That was a crazy entity, lot of mysterious properties, but people believed in that, and nobody was prepared to do an experiment. It was Albert Michelson, the first American Nobel laureate, who actually did that experiment in collaboration with Morley, because he thought that when there is an ether and Earth is moving around the sun through that ether, the velocity or speed of light in different directions will be different, because we are moving along the ether in an angle with the ether or perpendicular to ether, etc. And that difference, the deviation, will be maximum between two perpendicular light rays. And we all know he constructed the Michelson-Morley interferometer to do that experiment, and found that there is no difference between light propagating along the ether direction or along the motion of the direction and perpendicular to the motion of the earth direction. That came as a surprise to all, including Michelson. He repeated the experiment several times. Several people tried to explain that in their own ways, Fitzgerald, Lorentz contraction, etc. But in the 1905, the eminent genius Albert Einstein published a special theory of relativity, where he discussed the electrodynamics properties in detail. And there he took the idea of constancy of velocity of light as a very basic principle and developed the special theory of relativity. And that is the history of classical vacuum, nothing interesting. But when we reach the case of quantum mechanics, the entire thing changed. Because quantum mechanics actually altered the properties of vacuum. We can see in that screen, I have written the basic idea of quantum mechanics, which you all know, that is the non-commutativity of the position operator and momentum operator, and all dynamical variables treated as operators. And I have written the statistical rule below that, which directly gives the Heisenberg's uncertainty relation for delta x and delta p. And it actually tells us that nothing can be still. You cannot be at rest. And the next part of that, or the energy part of that, that is delta E, delta T is greater than h bar divided by 2. Actually, that gives the idea that you can have a large amount of energy if the time is made extremely small. And energy, according to Einstein, is clearly a particle or a mass, and therefore the large amount of energy which is present inside the vacuum, which exists only for a short interval of time, which obeys Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, generated the idea which we now call as the quantum fluctuation. It cannot be still, therefore it is fluctuating. Therefore, vacuum is highly active region. When you remove everything, you cannot remove everything. Something will be there. A bit which cannot remove, according to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, will remain, and it is fluctuating. It is fluctuating because otherwise that uncertainty principle will be violated. That is, if it is not fluctuating, you can measure time accurately. If it is having a zero energy, you can measure energy accurately. That is not possible. And we will later see that it led to the idea of a 0-point energy. But we don't know what actually is fluctuating there. To that we will come later. Something is fluctuating. Something inside the vacuum is fluctuating. And this fluctuating thing, whatever it is, produces some kind of particle, which we call as the virtual particles, because it is unlike real particles which we see around. These virtual particles exist only for an extremely small duration of time. It will appear and immediately disappear to obey the Heisenberg's uncertainty relation. At that time, people thought that it is not a valid principle, but experimentally, it has been proved that quantum fluctuation is a valid physical phenomenon. That is, vacuum contains quantum fluctuations everywhere, virtually everywhere in the universe. There is nowhere quantum fluctuation do not exist. Vacuum means the existence of quantum fluctuation. And the experimental, there were several experimental proofs like lamp shift, etc. I will be discussing only two of them. One is the famous Casimir effect. Casimir effect tells you that if you take two metallic plates, non-conducting, conducting uncharged metallic plates, and keep it very small distance apart of the order of few nanometers in vacuum, they will be moving together, one is moving towards the other, and finally they will combine together and they will join together. And this is a very interesting theoretical prediction that was predicted in 1948, and it was experimentally verified in 1998. People actually took very, very thin and very almost massless mirrors and did this experiment, and they got somewhat 5% accuracy results. And several experiments said that or proved that Casimir effect is a real effect. In order to explain that, we have to bring in the quantum mechanical idea or the idea of the of de Broglie to show that there exist matter waves. And when matter waves exist in between these plates, we can see that the matter waves, the wavelength of matter waves, if d is the separation between the plates, the wavelength is restricted to 2d divided by n, because lambda by 2 is the smallest, this is the largest wavelength that can be contained inside that, and the lambda by 2 should be equal to d, and it's all integral multiples of lambda by 2 is permitted. Therefore, but outside that, there is no restriction. Outside it is vacuum. All sorts of virtual particles exist outside. Only small number of virtual particles remain inside the plates, and therefore the virtual particles outside will push the plates together, and consequently we will get the Casimir effect. Therefore, it without any doubt proved that Casimir effect is a real phenomenon. But as far as theoreticians are concerned, it is more important, because we theoretical physicists have, apart from that experimental beauty of that, it has a very, very important theoretical. That is, if you provide some kind of boundary to vacuum, here we are actually making a physical boundary through the Casimir plates. But if we are making some kind of vacuum in the in between, or a border in that, or a boundary in that vacuum, that will alter the entire physics. In classical mechanics also we have, in classical theory, classical physics also, for example, surface tension, you are actually creating a boundary, pressure, you are actually creating an enclosure, like that. There are several phenomena. And as far as new physics is concerned, that the physics of 21st century is concerned, this boundary in the vacuum is an important ingredient in modern theory. That is why Casimir experiment and Casimir effect becomes important nowadays. There are certain other effects like Lamb shift, etc., which is operating inside the atom, etc. But the most important thing is that we have the universe itself. Universe itself started as quantum fluctuations, and you have the inflationary scenario after that, some 10 raised to minus 33 seconds in that time, and then that quantum fluctuation is actually giving its impression or its watermark on the observable thermal radiation, microwave background radiation. And this particular figure which I have shown there, which is the figure of the baby universe taken by the Wilkinson probe, etc. And that also shows that universe actually started as quantum fluctuations. But we don't know. Something is fluctuating. What actually is fluctuating, nobody knows even now. Some call it as inflaton, some call it as Higgs field, some other things. But actually we don't know. What was fluctuating at that point, we don't know. That is something which we have to discover later. But at present, we don't know what it is. But that's something is fluctuating. And this gives us the idea of virtual particles, and that virtual particles were created at the start of the universe. And whenever we have a vacuum, now that will be full of the virtual particles. They continuously appear and disappear. But they exist only for an incredibly short interval of time. But then the question arises, what about the real particles which we see, which is there and which is always there? There are the particles like electrons, protons, neutrons, all these particles. Where do they come from? What is their actual dynamics? How can we explain the dynamics of an electron, for example? And people seeking answers to that actually found that it is a very, very subtle and difficult problem, because it was started by Schrödinger himself. Schrödinger knew that his theory is not Lorentz covariant. Manifestly it is not Lorentz covariant, because it contains an energy term which is in first order and momentum term which is second order, and energy or momentum are components of the same 4 vector. Therefore, you cannot have that to be Lorentz invariant. He actually tried an energy equation the relativistic energy equation, E square is equal to P square C square plus M square C raised to 4. But he failed. He derived an equation. And once George Sudarshan has commented that we call it as Klein-Gordon equation because Schrodinger wrote it first. Schrodinger wrote that equation first, but he did not publish. Unlike most of us, he was reluctant to publish without confirmation. He actually applied his theory to hydrogen atom, and to his surprise, he found that hydrogen atom do not give correct result in using his theory. It is not giving correct result using his theory means he actually did not publish that. Klein and Gordon published, and it came to be known in their name. Schrodinger do not want because he has his landmark in his. That equation is non-relativistic in the sense that it's not carrying a clock. Relativistic, both the observer and the particle. Particle should have his own clock giving his proper time, and observer should have his own clock giving his own proper time. Therefore, it is not truly relativistic. So is the equation P square divided by 2m, which E is equal to P square divided by 2m, which Schrodinger used for deriving his famous equation. But as people think H psi is equal to E psi is not actually a Schrodinger equation. It actually gives you only an eigenvalue equation. If that H happens to be P square divided by 2m, and when you make the operator replacement, you get the Schrodinger equation. But H psi is equal to E psi is always valid. It is a simple eigenvalue equation. Therefore, he started using this relativistic energy equation, P square C square plus M square C raised to 4. I am not going to the details of that. It met with several disasters. But it was Dirac who actually thought of using this in a fantastic manner. That is what I have written there. That is, if somebody tell you that root of a square plus b square is equal to a plus b, any teacher, any high school teacher will tell you that is stupid. But the student asks a smart question: what if ab plus ba is equal to 0? We know that ab plus ba is equal to 0 simply means that a square plus b square is equal to square root of a square plus b square, or a plus b whole square will be equal to a square plus b square. And that PC and MC square which is found there are not satisfying AB plus BA is equal to 0. Therefore, what Dirac did is a very, very nice technique. He wrote that instead of A plus B, he wrote alpha A plus beta B whole square. And then he attributed certain properties to this alpha and beta, which is alpha square and beta square turns out to be 1. And alpha beta plus beta alpha, which is the anti-commutation relation, vanishes. And that algebra, which is different from ordinary Lie algebra, is sometimes called Clifford algebra. And therefore, he succeeded in writing energy as a first order equation, and consequently, he could derive the first order equation, which is now known after his name. The 4x4 matrices he have discovered, that is alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha 3, and also alpha 4 or beta. They are now called as Dirac matrices, and they are actually constructed out of the Pauli spin matrices, which are also a Clifford algebra, and it is known as Dirac matrices. And based on the properties of alpha and beta, now we can write the Dirac Hamiltonian. That is, simply you can write E is equal to alpha PC plus beta MC square, and that is known as the Dirac Hamiltonian. If that Dirac Hamiltonian is written in the H psi is equal to E psi, we will get this wonderful relation, which is called the Dirac equation. It contains d psi by dt on the left hand side and d psi by dx on the right hand side. All are first order, and this is a first order equation with the 4x4 matrices, alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha 3, and alpha 4. And this is a compressed form of writing that using that sigma notation. The gentleman I have shown on the right hand side, actually he developed the path integral formalism, he also plays a historical role in the development of relativistic quantum mechanics and subsequent quantum field theory. That is why I have included this picture there. I will give the importance of his idea later. And this is what we get. I h bar gamma mu d mu psi minus mc psi is equal to 0 is the relation. I think there should be, there is a small correction, that is not a problem. That is equal to 0. And this is, according to Feynman, this is one of the jewels of physics. That is an extremely beautiful equation. And that d mu actually represents the partial derivative with respect to the position coordinates, d by dx1, d by dx2, d by dx0, like that. But that gamma mu is a 4 by 4 matrix. Therefore, our psi should be a column matrix having 4 inputs. Then only you can multiply that. That multiplication otherwise is not comfortable for multiplication. So psi becomes a 4-component entity, and that is called a 4-component spinor. And it is very, very interesting to understand what actually we mean by this 4-component spinor. I am not going to the properties of spinor dynamics and etc. But the two of the particles which I have shown at the top corresponds to 2 electrons which up spin and down spin, and that given below, that is in that different color, corresponds to something which is unknown. And it turned out that particles actually represent the particles having negative energy, because the negative energy actually is the basic defect of E square is equal to P square plus P square C square plus M square C raised to 4. It is the basic defect of in using particle mechanics in relativistic basic problem, relativistic mechanics, etc. But now if we cannot ignore that, because we should have a complete closed Hilbert space for doing with quantum mechanics, and without the negative energy you cannot have a closed and complete Hilbert space. Therefore you have to include that, but it is not observable. The problem I have shown there with that revolving electron in that magnetic field, if that electron revolves in that magnetic field, it can continuously lose energy, and there is no positive ground state. Therefore it can go down, and it can go down to infinite levels down, and it can emit infinite amount of energy, which is totally unphysical. And we don't observe negative energy particles. If we succeeded in observing negative energy particles, then that is okay. Then we could take this wave function seriously, but it is not. Therefore, Dirac actually did in this manner. It is a very, very interesting, one of the spectacular insights of Dirac, which tells you that Dirac particles, that is electrons, are fermions. Therefore, only one electron can remain in one energy level. Therefore, he said that there are infinite energy levels which is negative and positive, but all the infinite energy levels are completely filled. Therefore, according to Pauli's exclusion principle, you cannot observe that particular particle. Negative energy particles are not observable, and that is his vacuum. So he actually totally modified the concept of vacuum. According to Dirac, vacuum consists of a completely full of negative energy states, which we now call of the Dirac sea, and a completely empty positive energy states. And if you solve the equation, you can see that there is a gap between those two, having a value equal to 2mc square. It is not joining together, but there is a gap which is a forbidden gap. No particle having that energy can exist. And therefore, he then continued to develop his theory, which is now called the Hall theory, where when a radiation is coming, which is having a value equal to the difference between those two levels, that will create a particle in the negative energy level will absorb that and it will migrate to, it will cross the forbidden gap and migrate to the positive energy levels, and we observe it as an electron. So an electron is created. But there is a vacancy in the negative Dirac sea, and that vacancy acts as a particle which, according to the charge conservation, should have a positive charge. All other things remaining same. Therefore, it is a positively charged electron, which people called as an anti-electron at that time, and the anti-electron subsequently were called as positron. I'm not going to the history of that. And that is actually called the pair creation. And immediately this electron and hole will recombine again, and a radiation will be produced, and that is usually called the pair annihilation. And people actually thought of it as a philosophical, a mathematical, technical aspect, having no practical implications, even though the theory is extremely beautiful. But when Anderson's cloud chamber track is, which I have shown in that slide, that is moving in the opposite direction of that of the electron, which identify the mass is same as that of the electron, but the charge is different. And we say that Anderson discovered this antiparticle called the positron for the first time in his experiments using cosmic rays, using a cloud chamber. And that is very nice thing. But now comes, people actually move away with or develop the particle physics research. They constructed several cosmic ray experiments. They constructed their accelerators and all. Actually, the development of science, development of the theoretical ideas is intimately connected with the technological revolution. People started constructing accelerators, people constructed smashers, colliders, etc. And experimental particle physics developed. Also, with the advance of computers, they could analyze large amount of data. And by 1980, this was the situation. That is, we have matter particles, 3 of them. One is electron, other is 2 quarks, which is called the up quark and down quark, which forms all the materials. All material which we see in the universe is made up of these particles. Atoms are made up of these particles. 2 up quarks and 1 down quarks form the proton. 2 down quarks and 1 up quark forms a neutron, and electron is separate. These quarks interact through its gluons, which is called the strong interaction. These weak interacting particles, they produce neutrino and all those things. That was the particle physics in 1980, and this is the complete particle picture we now have. That is the 6 quarks, 6 leptons, including electron, muon, tau, and their corresponding neutrinos, and 5 bosons interacting bosons, the gauge bosons, W boson, Z boson, gluon, photon, and the strange particle scalar boson, which we call as the Higgs boson. When Higgs boson was discovered in 1913, by 2013, he was given the Nobel Prize in 1960s, he actually suggested, when some of us started doing research in particle physics, this was a hot area. That was the Goldstone bosons are developed, how Goldstone's bosons get mass, the Higgs mechanism for that, the prediction of Higgs particle, etc. But nobody saw it. But in 2012, we all know that this small kink, which this thing which we, I don't know whether you can see that in the screen, my cursor, that particular hilly-like thing actually represents the Higgs particle. People call it as God particle in a wrong sense. Actually, it was the author of that book actually called this as a goddamn particle, and the publisher made it as God particle. That is all. There is nothing, no connection with Higgs field and God. But the important thing is that without that, we cannot give mass. Particles have 2 important and fundamental properties: the mass and charge. Charge, people knew that it is due to the interaction between a particular type of potential, mu type potential, and a 4 potential and 4 current. That interaction gives us the the coupling constant in that interaction actually gives us charge in all areas in QCD also. That is different types of charges, that is color charge, etc. But the basic mechanism is same. But how these objects gain mass, that can also be only done by this Higgs field, which is a scalar field, and that corresponds to the particle corresponding to that is actually called that Higgs boson. When it is detected, we have all particles in standard model. But this gives a very serious problem which is put forward by Feynman. Feynman, when started doing research, he actually thought that all these concept of the vacuum, concept of field, etc. are rubbish. And he thought that the entire thing can be done in terms of particles. One of the main reasons he have developed the path integral formulation of quantum mechanics and also the Feynman diagrams was to reinstate the importance of particles. But he miserably failed. We know that if somebody tell you that there is a particle, this theory tells you that you can actually compute the transition probability of that particle by summing over all the space-time trajectories between those two events, which actually is a sum over history. And we can obtain the generating function for that, the propagator for that, etc. We know that we have a particle is relativistic. We know how to write the Lagrangian of the relativistic particle, that is well known. We all know how to write the Lagrangian of a relativistic particle, that is an elementary problem. And that can be forming the part of an action, you can develop the action. But when you use that action in the path integral formalism, the mathematics developed will stand up and say that I am not a particle, I am a field. Because of the creation and annihilation of particles and antiparticles come in between, you have seen the Feynman diagrams corresponding to those several bubbles. And when you add them together, we will get an infinite degrees of freedom, and it will announce himself that I am not a particle, I am a field. Same is true for Dirac also. Dirac actually, we have asked Dirac to develop the theory of an electron, but he gave us a multi-particle theory, not a single particle theory. And therefore, a particle theory do not exist. The fundamental theory for describing particle should come from fields. And when these fields obey the quantum principles in the quantum world, that particular field obeys quantum principles, then we call it as a quantum field. Therefore, now we believe that our vacuum is full of completely filled with fields. Each field corresponding to each particle which we have seen as fundamental particles. Therefore, when you say that the entire universe is made up of these 17 particles, according to standard model, that is a lie. That is a lie in the sense that the fields are more fundamental, not particles. You don't have particles. Particles are only excitations in the field. Therefore, field is fundamental. Therefore, our vacuum picture has totally changed. We have a field corresponding to each of that particles. The pictorial representation of that is given there. Our Dirac C has taken a very complicated thing. That is, you have an electron field, you have an up quark field, you have a down quark field, you have a W boson field, you have a gluon field, like that. 17 fields intertwined together, forming a very complicated structure, which is actually vacuum. This is actually and they are fluctuating continuously. And the question which we have raised at the start of this talk, that is what actually is fluctuating, we have the answer. The field is fluctuating. Fluctuating fields actually is the vacuum. We may think that it is complicated, but it is not. It is the simplest description one can make regarding the nature of particles. It cannot be simpler. As things stands now, it cannot be simpler. This is the simplest approach. People usually say that the quantum field theory is extremely complicated. It has a lot of complicated mathematics, etc. But you must think that if you have to describe a particle truly, do everything regarding that particle using a relativist theory, it is much, much more complicated than a quantum field theory. Quantum field theory is the simplest theory which we can imagine. It is not a complicated theory. It is the simplest theory. A very trivial form of representing a field is this. That is, you attach, field is actually a quantity attached to each point. Here you, and that is fluctuating in time. Therefore, we associate with each point in space-time a fluctuating amplitude, which can be represented in the simple manner. The simplest type of field which we can imagine is this harmonic oscillator field, which Planck actually, when describing his Planck radiation theory when he developed in 1900, actually he thought electromagnetic wave as a collection of harmonic oscillators. That is a very, very interesting thing. But this harmonic oscillator behaves differently in quantum mechanics. Therefore, we have to consider the behavior of a harmonic oscillator. It is a very, very simple thing. It is not complicated. Only thing is that we have to be familiar with that. When you look at it, as I have seen the a square plus b square situation in Dirac theory, it is such a simple thing. Here also, we have a Hamiltonian, that Hamiltonian which is p square by 2m plus half kx square is the Hamiltonian for a vibrating spring, we all know from high school classes. And the first thing we are going to do is we consider it as a square plus b square, and we can factorize it simply as a plus ib and a minus ib. When you factorize that, you will get two entities. One we call as a and other as a star, which is the complex conjugate. That is all. Nothing else is to be done. Nothing else is to be done regarding the harmonic oscillator. Then we find that the magic of quantum mechanics appears. That is, our aim is to describe a field not as an ordinary field but as a quantum field. Then we need an operator. Therefore, fields are treated as operators. Whether it is scalar field or different types of gauge fields or whatever it is, we treat it as operators. Therefore, if you consider these two and a and a star, and we can simply work out the commutation relation for them, any person can do, because it is a commutation relation between pp, px twice, and also xx. Two of them will cancel, and you have with the you can make a and the commutation and I'm not going to explain that. And this relation n plus r omega, which explains several things, which we take is 0 omega gives at a particular point, and you have infinite point, therefore we have infinite 0 point energy. Therefore, you have a vacuum which is in energy. It's not observable in standard model. In standard model, it is not observable. Therefore, we are not much bothered about that. We are bothered about the difference in energies. Therefore, this huge value of vacuum energy or zero-point energy is not going to bother us much. Now, using these two operators, we can write the field operator. Don't think that it is a very, very complicated operator. It is very, very simple. When you consider the field in the position space, it is localized at a particular position. That is, you take a small volume around, just like we are addressing the density fluctuation in the case of sound waves. You take a very small volume, consider the average density at the point of the density variable, and like that. Here we have a field variable. Here we have a field variable, and this field variable, you take a small volume there, take the average of that. That average is treated to be a field variable that is at a particular localized position. But we are not able to do much mathematics with that. Therefore, we go to the momentum space. I don't have the picture of that here. I actually, to reduce the number of slides, I did not include that. Actually, we have simple arrows of momentas in another space, which is filling. Therefore, we have corresponding to one particular oscillator localized at a particular point, we have infinite number of momentum oscillators. But the advantage is that those momentum oscillators are uncoupled and we are always interested in uncoupled equations because they can be easily superimposed. Therefore, when you make the field operator which is found in the left side of that equation, we make a transformation to the momentum space on the right hand side. We have infinite momentas available, therefore we integrate it from minus infinity to plus infinity. And this entity is what we call as a field operator. And the entire field theory in the elementary level and also in the advanced level, even when you go to higher levels, yes. Okay. Therefore, this is the final slide. I am not going to introduce the other vacuum properties. This is the final slide. When we consider all those ideas related to field theory, what we get is this wonderful equation. This is the equation for the standard model, and you can see all those. Any experiment which we do in the Earth can be explained using this simple relation. It has gravity, it has electromagnetism, strong force, weak force, etc. And therefore, it explains everything. And therefore, we conclude that inside the Earth, on the surface of the Earth, including all the particle accelerators, including everything, can be explained using this relation. Therefore, thank you for, because of the lack of time, I could not explain the Hawking temperature, etc. That I shall do in some other occasion. Thank you for the patient listening. Bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Sadish sir, for the meticulous narration of fluctuating vacuum, which means quantum fluctuations, virtual particles, Casimir effect, negative energy states, and description of particles as field, then finally of field operators to represent field. Now it's time for discussions. Active participation or active interaction from participants are expected.
Hello?
I can't hear
Hello?
you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But I can't hear the other people saying.
Nobody is saying anything. Nobody is asking
Nobody
any
started
question.
asking questions.
Sir, I have a doubt.
Okay.
You made a comment regarding the Klein-Gordon equation. You said that it is not truly a relativistic equation. So, can you explain?
I think I didn't say. I said that about the Schrodinger equation. Definitely, Klein-Gordon equation also is a truly relativistic equation. There is no doubt about that, because it is developed from. It also has the observer, both the observer and the particle has a clock, because it is developed from the relativistic equation.
You meant Schrodinger equation. Okay.
Yeah, that was Schrodinger equation. But Klein-Gordon equation is truly relativistic, and all scalar fields are described by such an equation. Scalar fields are so fundamental and so important. Therefore, you cannot say that that is non-relativistic. Then the scalar particles will not be there.
Okay.
The point is that
Klein-Gordon
field equation is okay because it describes the scalar field. But Klein-Gordon wave equation is not useful. It's not a covariant.
Yes, as a particle equation. It's a particle equation.
Yes.
But as a particle equation, Dirac theory also is. We cannot say that it is completely true, because it is not a single particle equation, it is a multi-particle equation. In that sense, it is a many-particle equation. Therefore, we don't have, strictly speaking, we don't have a particle equation in relativistic theory. We only have many particle equations or field equations. That is the actual. You cannot construct. That is a very simple result of relativity, because in relativity you consider time and space in the equivalent footing. Therefore, when you draw the world line of particles, your time axis can go backward because it is just like the space coordinate. Therefore, it can go backward. Therefore, you have a zigzag motion for that world line. Therefore, you take a particular proper time and draw a straight line, you can see that infinite number of particles is present at the same instant of time. Therefore, it is generally a consequence of the basic idea of special theory of relativity. You cannot have a single particle. Any single particle will eventually become a multi-particle system in relativistic theory. You cannot write a single particle equation in relativistic theory. Dirac also did not do that. Actually, his equation contains large number of particle-antiparticle pairs. I don't think that one will be, if it could be successful, then Feynman would have developed the particle physics instead of quantum field theory, but he failed.
Can we simply say that particle number is not conserved in relativity? So
particle, but
single particle equations are not consistent with.
Yeah, that is the if you consider the particle number to be non-conserved, because actually it is not, you cannot define a particle. That is the idea. You cannot define a particle. You can only define field excitations. You cannot define a particle in relativistic theories, because if you define a particle, immediately that will develop to a field. That is, I think that will be the correct approach rather than the occupational number formalism. Of course, occupational number formalism is a very, very interesting and useful practice, but conceptually, I think that it is much more deeper, because we are forced to remain in vacuum itself. These particles are only a very, very, very small amount in the entire universe. Therefore,
shall we wind up this discussion and move on to the next topic?
Yeah. That is.
Otherwise,
Yes,
we are
sir.
into time.
Yes, sir. And next talk is from Dr. Blessing George, Assistant Professor of Physics, CMS College. He is research student of Dr. Nainan Sajid Philip, and he has to deliver talk on an encounter of artificial intelligence with biomolecules. Dr. Blessing George, sir.
Okay, let me share the slide.
Of course, sir.
Now we can see that.
Okay. Okay. Shall I start?
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, all. Dear all, I feel it as a privilege to talk to this elite audience in a function arranged by the esteemed students of respected Babu sir. I remember the days when I came as a student for joining the BSc Physics at St. Thomas College, Koranjeri, where our seniors used to tell about Monsi sir and Sajid sir, and they both had done research under the guidance of Babu sir. So even without seeing or hearing Babu sir, generations of students like me respected him. Later, I joined for MSc at CMS College, and there also this name was very familiar. So now I have become the student of Babu sir, and I feel it as a privilege, and I thank Babu sir and all the organizers for giving me an opportunity for taking this talk. So today I am presenting some of the results of our work, and the title for the talk is given as An Encounter of AI with Biomolecules. In the current national education policy, we know that great stress is given to multidisciplinary research. So this work is actually a collaboration of people from diverse disciplines: physics, zoology, biotechnology, computer science, and it turned out to be a good work indeed. So before presenting the results of our work, I would like to give a brief description about the biomolecule part of this work, since most of the audience are relatively new to this field. Okay. So we all know about proteins. Proteins are large complex molecules that play many critical roles in our body. They do most of the works in cells and are required for the structure, function, and regulation of our body's tissues and organs. So our human body consists of trillions of cells, and each cells have thousands of different proteins. So basically, amino acids are the building blocks of protein. So it is the amino acids that synthesize protein and other important compounds in the human body. So some of the familiar proteins are creatine, peptide hormones, some neurotransmitters. So there are around 20 amino acids, and these amino acids are arranged in millions of different ways to create millions of different proteins, each with a specific function in the body. So collagen, insulin, hemoglobin, they are all different kinds of proteins which are seen in our body. So proteins are chains of amino acids that are connected by peptide bonds and folded into three-dimensional structure. So most interesting part for the biology people or the people who do research in this protein studies, the main field of interest is the protein structure, because the shape of the protein is critical to its function. It determines whether a protein can interact with other molecules, or having a protein structure provides a great level of understanding of how protein structure works, how it affects control, or how we can modify it. And see, in a nutshell, knowing about the protein structure will solve many of the problems or give insight about the protein and how they can be applied. Even in pharmaceutical areas, people use this protein structure to develop new medicine and all. So there are, I will jump through one or two slides. I will go through very fast. What are the research techniques which are used to study the structural biology? So single crystal X-ray diffraction. So this is the same technique which we use in our studies in material science or nanotechnology. The protein is made as a single crystal, and the X-ray beams are used to understand the structure. But it have got two challenges. The first challenge is the crystallization of large biological or biomolecules with large molecular weight is difficult. And also in XRD, the static form of the molecule is obtained, which could result in loss of many of the orientations of molecule. So what happened? People thought of other options, and then came NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance. So this is also another prominent technology, but it has also got some limitations like XRD. Understanding the structure of large macromolecules is difficult. Also, NMR requires pure samples for good SNR, and it also limits the type of molecules which can be studied with NMR. So then comes the invention of this century. Maybe this is one of the very promising inventions of this century. It's using cryo-EM. Cryo means cold, cryogenic, and EM means our electron microscope. So this is the most promising technique to understand the structure of biomolecules. So it's basically cryogenic electron microscopy. So more precisely, the electron beams in TEM, transmission electron microscopy, is used to understand the structure of the specimen. So the interference between scattered and the non-scattered electrons result in the so-called phase contrast and image formation. These are the same principle which we see in the TEM. Everywhere SEM and TEM we are familiar, mainly the material science people. So TEM is used to study the property or the structure of the biomolecules. So I'm not going into much detail of that. So cryo-EM using a TEM have two main challenges. The first challenge is that electron microscope requires high vacuum. So living cells or generally the hydrated samples, which are more common in biomolecules, cannot be examined by this method at room temperature. Secondly, when we apply electron beam to biological samples, they are vulnerable to electron beam damage. So the electron dose has to be kept very low, and indeed that will result in a low SNR, signal to noise ratio. So these two challenges are overcome very interestingly. So first solution was sample vitrification. Vitrification means what they do is that the protein solution is instantly cooled, sharply or not in a continuous manner. It is instantly cooled so that water molecules do not crystallize, forming a glass-like substance. The frozen sample is then screened and data is collected in the system. Or in other words, the cryogenic sample grid preparation allows fixing biological sample by rapidly transferring and cooling them in a liquid ether. Say it will go up to minus 188 degrees Celsius. Under these conditions, ice crystal will not be formed. So what will happen? The specimen integrity will be preserved, and ideally cryo-EM samples should be, it is contained in a very thin layer of vitreous ice with thickness possibly as close to the dimensions of the particle. So thus they solve the first problem. So it's called the vitrification. They have put it in a ice, but ice is not crystalline, but the protein structure will be preserved. And the second one they overcome by taking a series of two-dimensional image. Actually, one significant development was the that made the recent breakthrough was the introduction of direct electron detector. So that's a new type of detectors which is used in TEM, which could operate at higher frames rate, allowing recording right from the sample preparation to get the
Recording is on.
right from the sample preparation to get taking the 3D model. So they'll make it a 2D by placing the sample in a grid. Then, as we have said, they'll freeze it to sample will be vitrified and it is placed in an electron microscope. And there, as we have said, there will be some motion will be induced. That motion will be corrected, and there is a process called CTF correction that will be done, and we'll get image like the one which I have showed in the last slide. And from there, what they'll do, they'll pick the particles. They'll manually click on each particle and select the particles and do the 2D classification. So the resulting 2D classification, this is a like a example image, like a image particle will be having different orientations. And these orientations will be class based on cross correlation, and similar looking, or the particles with similar orientations will be classified into one class. And later, using Fourier transform and such techniques, they will build a 3D map, and after refinement, we'll get the structure of the protein. So this is the pipeline for getting the 3D model right from a sample. So the bottleneck in making so people are trying to generate the 3D model automatically from this TEM image. And there is a bottleneck, and that bottleneck is particle picking. So I think for all other techniques, motion correction, CTF estimation, classification, and all, they have developed automatic tools. But the current challenge is the particle picking. At some point of time, people have to sit literally and click on each particles, right on the center of these particles to get the particle, to select the particles. So this is a real challenge. And I will show how difficult is this particle picking process. So see this image. This picture or this micrograph is having nearly say 100 to 200 particles, and see the burden of the people. They have to sit and literally click on the center of each particles. I have marked it. So after clicking, they will get a box like this, which have a particle in it. So this is the challenge of particle picking. All the particles have to be manually picked by clicking at the exact center of the particle. So generally 20 to 200 particles will be present in a micrograph. And so they have to make 20 to 200 clicks in one micrograph, and nearly 100 to 1000 micrographs are needed to solve a structure. So it's like making 20,000, 30,000 click to get the structure of a protein. So this was the challenge. And even more, see this image. So this is a protein called beta-gal. And see, it has got more than 1000 particles in an image, and people have to sit and click all these 1000 particles to solve the structure. So this is a real challenge. And moreover that, so this is this is a sample image. Can you see a particle inside this blue colored circle? It is even very difficult to see with our naked eyes. And there are some other contaminants present in this micrograph. For example, the one which I am showing now, it's called a vitreous or crystalline ice, which is formed as a contaminant while the process of sample vitrification. So this is not a, sometimes the people will have a we will wrongly interpret this as a particle. So one of the challenge is that there will be a manual bias. There will be a tendency to wrongly classify contamination as a particle. And see, this kind of dark blobs, these are also contamination. These are not particles. What I have shown, these faint objects are the particles, and we have to click on these particles to select them. So this is the challenge. And one more thing, these all techniques developed after say 2016 or so. All these developments happened in the last 4 or 5 years, and this is one of the field which is developing very fastly. So this is the challenge, and people started solving it through different automated methods from say 2017 or so. We can see different papers, or 2006 we can see different papers trying to solve this problem. So these are some of the noteworthy tools for particle picking. I have listed some. Maybe there are around 20 or 30, but these are the prominent ones which are people using for automating this particle picking process. So anyway, all these tools requires manual particle picking at training phase or at some stage of their processing. So the problem with manual particle picking is that it induces human bias. It is all based on the picking or the expertise of the people who is picking the particle. There are strong tendency to wrongly pick a particle. And also centering of particle is an issue. That means they have to pick right at the center of the particle, or the particle will be broken or cut out, or it will be cropped out. So that's also a challenge. So when we try to solve this problem, so we saw that there are different kinds of objects in a particle. So I have numbered it as 1, 2, 3. One, there is something called a vitreous ice. There is something called contaminants, and there is something called protein particles. And moreover, that below everything there is a background like thing. So we found that there are 4 different objects, or 4 different objects in this micrograph. There is a background, there is a vitreous ice, contaminations are there, and protein particles are there. And we observed that different objects in this micrograph is having different contrast. And it should be so, because the scattering density of different molecules depends on its molecular weight. And these different objects are having different molecular weights, and hence they have different levels of scattering intensity. Background particles, ice, and ethane contaminations have different contrast. So we developed a tool which used certain image processing techniques, and which would enhance the contrast and give different level of thresholding. And we threshold this image at different levels, where contaminant is having one threshold, ice is having another, proteins is having another, background is having another. And we were able to segregate this micrograph into 4 different classes based on this contrast. And we developed a tool which could segregate based on the contrast threshold. So we use some techniques called contrast enhancement, bilateral filtering. This is a complex filter in which space filtering and intensity filtering is simultaneously done to preserve the edge while filtering the continuous region. So this is the pipeline of our labeling tool. So we normalize it, then we apply a Gaussian filter. After that, something called a Clahe. I'll explain it in the next slide. What is a Clahe? And bilateral filtering, contrast enhancement is applied. Then we done a color thresholding and size filtering. And after that, so after color thresholding and size filtering, we could clearly see different particles, differently. But we saw that the ice and particles is above a certain threshold. So we selected the ice particle, which are very few compared to particles, and we gave a different color for that. So this is the technique called Clahe. This was very one of the major advantage of this labeling tool. And this was a big challenge for many of the tools which were currently in the field, and many stumbled on this problem. The problem was that this micrograph is having contrast difference. Some part of the micrograph is having a different contrast than the other part of the micrograph. So we applied a technique called Clahe. It is a histogram equalization or contrast limited adaptive histogram equalization, in which histogram above a certain value is clipped to get a uniform contrast. So the leftmost image is our raw micrograph, and we have enhanced it, that is seen as the enhanced it without Clahe effect, that is seen as the middle image, and we can see that there is a contrast difference. But when we applied Clahe, the rightmost image, we see that the contrast is removed, or the entire micrograph is having same contrast. And so we selected these size particles like this and give a label for that. And at last, we could get the labels like this. So in this, different class of objects are given different colors. So there is on the rightmost top part, there is the vitrosize contamination. There is ethane contamination. Background is given in blue color. The protein is given in red color and all. So similarly, we developed labels for different proteins. So these are some of the sample labels which we have developed. And there is a machine learning or artificial intelligence branch called semantic segmentation. So semantic segmentation, the name itself means that an image is segmented based on its semantics. That means it based on the type of objects in this class. I'll show you an image. So this is one of the label for semantic segmentation. So this semantic segmentation is widely used for autonomous driving and such many advanced techniques. Semantic segmentation is used. So this building is having a different color, car is having a different color, trees are having a different color, road is having a color. So each object in this image is having different colors. So that's why we call them semantic segmentation. So this is a semantically segmented label. And we thought that we can apply this technique to solve our problem. So for training the data, we have giving the training data, which is a raw micrograph, and we have the label. So our image, which is semantically segmented, is given as the training label, and the machine is trained. And I'll show the results. So this is one of the results. This is a protein called KLH. So the left one is a label which we have created manually. So we trained a different set of, say, 20 micrographs like this, and it took around 20 minutes or so to label it. And we have given it as a training data and trained it. And this is one of the unseen micrograph. This was not given for training. So we manually developed the label, and right image is the prediction result. See how close it is. It is having a precision of 92%, and a collection, and we've done the experiment and saw that precision value is 92%, recall value is 93%, which is good result in this field. And visually we can see that how perfectly it is working. So after this, we extract the center of these particles and give it for other processing steps, which is done using different tools. And later we developed a cross model. Cross model means we have trained 13 different protein data sets. And we developed a model based on that. And this is one of the image which is not trained. This protein is not trained. And we have used that cross model trained, that model which is trained on 13 different protein data sets to predict an unseen micrograph. So this is the result. This is having a precision around 80%. So almost, so I will show some more results. And this is another protein. So see, almost it is same as the label which we have created. And these are some of the other good predictions which we have got. A protein called ATS ribosome, it is having a precision of 95%. Another one, TCDA1 precision 98%. Another protein 80%. So these are good results compared to the existing technology, existing tools in this field. And after this particle picking, so this tool is available in GitHub or in public domain, which can be used to predict the new micrographs. So after particle picking, what people do, they will 2D classify it into different 2D classes and then make the 3D structure. So I will show a sample result which we have developed using a protein data set called TRPV. So this is the different orientations which we are getting from that faint image which we have seen earlier. So from that faint image, aligning different protein particles, we could see these kind of fine structures, different orientations. And this is the 3D structure which we developed using the particles picked using our tool. And we saw a result of 3.19 angstrom. We know that a better resolution means lower value in terms of angstrom. 3.19 angstrom we have got, and the ever published result is 3.27 angstrom. This is another interesting protein called TCDA1. So even the minor details, so these are some wing-like structures seen in this protein particle. So our result is comparable with the published result, 3.5 angstrom. So we develop method which we have developed. It has got few attractions. The first attraction is that we don't have to manually pick at any point. The manual bias, human bias, and the pain of manual picking is eliminated using our labeling tool. And we saw that our results are comparable with the our results are somewhere better than the existing results which people use to get through other methods or manual picking. And we have given a name called Casper. Casper means cryo EM automatic semantic segmentation based picker. It is abbreviated as Casper. Casper, a semantic segmentation based particle picking algorithm for single particle cryo-electron microscopy. And this paper is in the submission, and we have submitted it, revised it, and almost at the publication phase in the Nature Communications Biology. And actually, as I have said, this is a collaboration of 3 different institutes. We all know Professor Ajit Kambave from IUCAA, Dr. Nainan Sajid Philip, and NCCS Pune, National Center for Cell Science. They are one of our collaborators, Dr. Janesh and Radha. And we, Blessing George, Anshul. Anshuli was also a student at NCCS, and Geeta Paul and Robbie Jacob Roy. They are also from ARIS 4D. And we all 8 work together to develop this tool. And we hope it will be published very soon. So that is the result. I have eliminated, or I haven't said any technical thing in this talk because I thought it will be too difficult to understand. So that's the work which we have done, and I have showed the results. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Blessing sir, for the elaborate narration of need of cryo-EM, particle picking method, and for introducing rather novel labeling tool. All the best for their future studies. Now, this is interaction time from the participants. Questions, please.
I think this is a new technique. Nobody knows this. Simple sense, sir.
Yeah, people started working. Actually, it is a collab initiative by IUCAA to collaborate people from different disciplines to work together. So that's
Yeah.
where physics and biology.
Can it be used in medical field or indirectly?
Yes, directly. Actually, it's a big. People are working so fastly, and we were competing with MIT, work with MIT and all. So so many people are working in this field, and this is a very recent development. 4 or 5 years, it's all started.
Okay. Thank you very much for the new information.
Thank you.
I think Rosnes, I think Babu sir want to go for another
Leave.
appointment. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay.
shall we end this program formally
Session.
so that the other discussions would be done later? Another.
Let us fix the date of next program, or it will
No, we will have another unofficial meeting later
be okay.
next
Okay.
week. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you all the participants who participated in this meeting and were cooperating. And thank you, Dr. Professor K.P. Sadish and Professor Blessen, sir. Thank you all the participants once again. Let us wind up.